Today, we are going to really focus on how to build repeatable and reusable workflows inside of Invoke. You've got some person who is really kind of adept at using all of the tools, whether that's the generation tab or using workflows, and they identify all of these different cool ways of generating images, these different patterns that are useful in specific contexts, and they want to share that with other people. We've made it really easy to build those types of workflows and make them reusable. And that's what we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about building a repeatable workflow, something that you can reuse and share, how you would go about experimenting and figuring out what you want to do in the normal interface, and then extending that and making that very, very nice and easy to kind of reuse on a repeatable basis inside of the workflow system. So today, we are going to approach this with a couple of different use cases that primarily cater towards architecture. A lot of architecture firms are using this for various rendering tasks and visualization tasks in the process of working with their clients. And so those are the types of kind of materials we'll be focusing on. But I think there's some really cool use cases out of this. We'll also share out the workflows that we create today. So if anyone wants to use those, you can kind of play around with them. But right now we're looking at a sketch. This is a pretty rough, quick and loose type sketch of a residence. So you can kind of see the type of content we're working with on this one. What we're going to try to do is figure out how we can turn this into a more repeatable and reusable sketch to visualization type workflow, so that we don't have to recreate the wheel every single time. We're kind of figuring out what works for us and then making that our standard workflow. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our control layers. I'm going to add a layer, and I'm going to add our canny. Actually, no, you know what? I'm going to use Scribble. I think Scribble might be more appropriate here. I'm going to pass in our sketch. I've set my processor off by default for this processor, but typically I think it'll be set to line art. You can kind of configure this on your model settings, but I'm going to use the line art processor. I'm going to use the coarse line art processor. And the reason I'm doing that is because I really want to get like thicker lines, and I want to kind of capture the edges of this. We can see that when I do capture that, it's pulling out a lot of the detail. Because this is a really rough, loose sketch, it's not like, it wasn't drawn with a ruler. It's kind of more of a ideation type sketch. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to lower the weight here. And this might give us a little bit less fidelity on the sketch itself. We can play around to find kind of the right level here. And we'll talk about how we can expose this type of control to the end user and workflows as well. I'm going to go ahead and add in a prompt. We'll add in a negative prompt sketch. Distorted. I don't know. What would make a bad photo? Maybe painting. We'll give that a go. So we've got our Scribble control now. We've got this, and we're just going to see what we get. We're going to see if this works for us, right? We're just experimenting right now. The way to think about this is we're trying to find a general purpose setting that is going to be useful for us. And we're using this as kind of our experimentation ground to kind of get that and test it out. We see the house forming in the background, and we'll do some comparisons here once we get this generated to see how close it was to our sketch and whether we need to get it a little bit closer or whether we're okay with it. All right, so I'm using the Alt key. You can also right click and hit select for compare. We're going to compare this to the sketch. Generally, I think captures a lot of it. There's a couple of things that probably would want, if I were to be a perfectionist here, which we know I am, I'd want a little bit more clarity on the depth. Here is a little bit off. I think we're trying to convey a little bit of a depth here with kind of an angular corner. And there's a couple of ways that we could approach this. I'm not going to do these today, but if we were playing around with this, I, as a as a creator who's trying to get this type of control, it's possible that I have this, that I'm sketching over a render, and I could pass that in as a depth map. What I can also do is we can try amping up the control here, and we'll see if we get kind of like a little bit more adherence to the depth we're looking for. There's basically two ways to go about this. We could bring in a render with us, right? Something from Revit or another 3D modeling tool. You could bring that in addition to our scribble, and kind of use that as a supplementary control adapter, right? Bring in some of that depth and help highlight where we want that depth. The other thing is we can generate a couple of times and find a generation that does map to the depth we're looking for. This one's a little bit closer, not exactly what I'd be looking for, but we'll generate like maybe one or two more times, and then kind of see where we're feeling good about this workflow. But then if you find something that you do generate that is useful for you, you could pass that in as a depth control net and basically use the tool to bootstrap your way into the right depth that you're looking for. This might be the best one yet for what we're going for. Yeah, so there's a little bit of a miss here on this piece, but I think everything else is actually relatively well captured here, and it gives us a little bit of a useful beginning. Now, looking at this, it's kind of missing this window on the left-hand side. We could go in and, fix that if we wanted to, but today's focus is not creating the perfect image. It's creating a process that would be a useful place for starting points, right? Places that we could then go off from and reuse. And so in this case, what we're going to do now is, let's say we like this. Let's say that this is like demonstrated itself as a good starting point. Every image that you generate inside of Invoke bakes in the workflow that generated that image. And it's often a very good place to start when you're trying to create a new workflow, is get the foundation set up in the Generate tab, right? You are playing around with features. You've got a much better interface for adding and tweaking and poking and prodding. And then when you have a good foundation, you can click the Load Workflow button. This workflow is baked into the image. It's embedded inside the metadata. In our commercial product, we are also storing that in a database, so they actually have that and can rely on that workflow. And we're going to load that up. And what that's going to do is it's going to take everything that we just used to generate, and it's going to populate our workflow for us. It's going to give us a good place to start. We are now looking at basically the starter workflow here that generated this image. And this is going to be something that we can use to really recreate everything that we just talked about and really do a lot with it. So let's take a look at what we've got here. I've got a LoRa that has been added in. I'm going to say we want to keep that. We've got our model selection over here. I'm just going to move some of these things around so that I can kind of create a mental map of where we're at. So this is kind of all the model stuff over here. If I hold Shift and left click, I can kind of move this around. If I'm trying to get some organizational stuff going, I can go to my workflow editor settings and turn on Snap to Grid. This really just helps in kind of alleviating OCD if you're really trying to get everything really lined up. So we're going to put that there. We've got our prompts, and this is where I've kind of put some of the or where the prompt information has been captured. What we're probably going to want to do, just as like a first step, is we're going to want to make this a more generic input for a user. What I typically do is I'm going to bring this out, and I'm going to add a string join node. What a string join is going to do is going to have two strings that's basically just text. And the reason I do this is because I might, like in many use cases, I want to bake in a prompt. I want this to be kind of like hidden style prompt. I'm going to rename this just for like, us to review this. And this isn't going to be shown to me or to anyone I'm sharing this with. This is just something that's kind of like baked into the workflow. This is a core prompt. I don't want to have to think about adding this every single time. It's kind of like a template, right? This is always going to be appended to my prompt. What we're going to do is add a user prompt, and that's going to be our top box here. And I'm going to click the plus button to the right of that, which adds that to our linear view. And what we'll notice is I come in and say, you know, a nice house, modern, big windows. When this gets passed into our prompt box over here, it's going to be passed into both our prompt and style. It is going to pass in the entirety of this joined together. So it'll have the full prompt, but as a user, I only need to worry about this tiny piece in the field. And so that's kind of how you want to design or think about workflows, is baking in the things that you don't really want anyone else to have to worry about for this workflow, the stuff that is always going to stay the same. That is really going to live in these kind of hidden elements inside of the workflow. And you're exposing those things that would be useful to expose to the end user. So we've got that there. I'm not going to expose our negative prompt. We certainly could and do the same thing for it, but I'm going to leave that alone there as well. In this case, we'll assume that I've got the right model selected for the prompt that I put in. I've got the right LoRa's for the type of thing I'm going for. I don't want to expose those either. If you are going to have a more flexible environment where maybe you've got a couple of different custom LoRa's, you might want to expose the LoRa field and basically say, hey, what LoRa do you want to use for this specific use case? It really depends on how you're thinking about structuring this workflow, but in this case, we're going to keep it simple. Now, the next thing that we'll talk about that we probably want to focus on, I'm going to leave all of our prompt stuff up here. We're going to want to focus on our control net. Now, we'll notice here that our control net is going to be already pre-processed, right? This isn't a workflow that includes a lot of the processing that's going on. And so we are going to want to think about what type of image is our user putting in. In this case, we'll likely go through that same process we did before, which is using the line art processor. And that line art processor is going to be what takes the image in, finds the edges, and passes that to our control net. The piece here that's going to matter and that's important is that we're going to want this, because this is SDXL, we're going to want to set this to 1024 and 1024 respectively, just so that it's the right size of control net for what's going in. And as I recall, I set that to coarse. Now we could expose this as our image input, that this is where the image input's going to be. But typically what I find is that it's nice to have an image primitive, and that is just going to be like the general purpose of our input, and it goes into all downstream processes that are going to be used inside of the workflow. Now, this might be duplicative in this case, but it's a good habit to get in to think about the primitives, whether that's an image, whether that's a string. Those are going to be really useful nodes for user inputs because you can kind of feed them into a lot of different places. So this is where we're going to have our user upload your sketch. And we'll put that into our linear view. And now we've got a nice field there where the user is going to drop that. Now, if we think about how to make this dynamic, how do we make this usable such that any image can go in and it has the right size? We need to think about what size image are we generating? And that's going to be dictated by the noise. Now, the noise node in our workflow has been set to the initial image that we just generated, right? It's kind of this longer, wider image. And if we were always generating that size, maybe we didn't, ever vary that. We don't really need to worry about this. But typically, you're going to have an input that might be square, might be a little wider, and you're going to want that to be a little bit more flexible, which means two things. A, your noise node, you're going to want to make random. You're not going to want to generate the same picture every time. And so you're going to want a random integer to be fed into the seed. That just means your seed is going to be random every single time you generate it. It's not going to be the same image every time. But we also want this width and height to be dictated by our image input. Now, the piece that gets people tripped up sometimes is your image that you input might be a huge image. It might be a tiny image, right? It might be anywhere in between. And so we want to be able to take any input image and make sure that we're generating something that's the ideal size for the model that we are using. This is where the ideal size node comes in. So if we take this to the ideal size node, we're passing in our width and our height. And the ideal size node is going to figure out what model are we using, and it's going to output the right width and height for us to use on any image that would be related to it. So the thing that we need to pass in is we need to pass in our model. We'll pass that in from up here. And what this is going to do is it's just going to take the width and height, optimize it for the model that we're using. We can scale that up or down if we want to, but in this case, we're going to keep it the same image, the base image. And now we've got a width and height that we can use downstream. And so we're going to pass that into our noise node. And now we've got kind of a dynamic size generation based on our input. And again, that's coming from our image primitive here. The user uploads their sketch. That sketch is passed to our line art processor. The line art processor is then passing the processed image to our control net. We're applying that scribble based on all the settings that we had in our generation tab. And now that's all being passed in and updating this here. I'm going to delete the metadata node for now just because it keeps things simpler. And I believe we've got everything that we need to say happy with this. So let's save this workflow as my sketch to visualized building workflow. Maybe I'll take my out. That's a little bit 90s. I'll just say sketch to visualized building workflow. Save that. So now I've got that. I'm saving that to my account. If I'm on a team edition of Invoke, I can save that to the project that I'm working on, and other people can load this up by clicking the library button. They'll open it up. They'll see the sketch to visualize building workflow in the project, and they can load that. Somebody asked the question, would you want to generate the line art at the ideal size as well? Yes, but that's what I've kind of done here with detect resolution and image resolution. We could say we want to generate, maybe this is a good, like, just thinking through math and kind of what we would want to do. If we wanted to generate at the largest resolution that we can for this image, what we can do is we can put it on a, I believe it'll be an integer math node. So we've got an integer math that's going to take the width and the height, and we want the biggest one. So we're taking the maximum of A or B. What's the largest number between the width and the height? And then we're going to pass that into our detect and our image resolution. You can do that, or you can just put 1024. Either way, you're going to get something that's kind of like good enough for the generation process, but this is a way to like maximize or optimize it, right? So this is doing that math for us. And I'll just tuck that above the line art processor so that we can have that out of the way. And I think that we are in a good spot here to actually, since this is, we'll just save that. Since this is created, we'll check to see what else we're missing. Okay, we're just missing an image. Let's click the linear view, and now we're kind of here using the workflow or the consumer of this workflow now. I'll drop my image in, and I'll say a house made of sheet metal, rusty, big windows. We're gonna try something different, right? Maybe we'll put it desert, landscape. I'm trying to make sure that it works and kind of like generalizes to different styles. This is more of like a post-apocalyptic type output, but you get the idea. You'd put in whatever like siding you want. What we could also do is add in a IP adapter. I know this is probably like having a lot of fun, always does when we're recording. What we could put is an IP adapter to get some inspiration of style that we want, and that could also be passed in. Can either do that from the generation tab or inside of the workflow. Already built out this workflow, I can come in and make those tweaks here. The question is just, what do I want to use as additional inputs? So in this case, let's add an IP adapter. So I'm going to hit the space bar to open up my shortcut for finding a node. I'm going to type IP adapter. And what I want to do now is I want to add another input image. And I'm going to say, this is my inspiration image. I'm going to pick one of the IP adapter models. We'll go with my good old standard SDXL VITH. And I will change the weight to 0.6 and change the method to style. So basically, this is an IP adapter set to the style mode with a weight of 0.6. And that's going to really kind of like inject some inspiration from an input image and pass that into the generation process. So that gives me another input that I need to have. I'm going to save this as sketch to visualize building workflow with inspiration. And I'll save that one. So now I got two workflows that came from that one process, but now I'm just kind of creating variants that might have different features or use cases for the user, so that when I distribute this to my team, they don't have to think about like, oh, I need to go in and add an IP adapter. Oh, I don't, what setting do I use to get that kind of like look and feel for the process we're using it for? You kind of have already pre-configured that for them. And now you're just kind of like reusing that. It can often be fun to give your workflows fun and exciting names like Inspiro Sketch TM. And then people are like, oh yeah, it's the Inspiro Sketch workflow. I throw in a sketch and an inspiration image and it generates something for me, right? Obviously, your team might hate you if you do that, so be warned. In this case, though, we'll keep our sketch image. What I'm going to do is maybe just throw in this kind of like stylistic inspiration image, and I'm just going to say a modern house. I'm not telling it what to do. I'm showing it using the inspiration image, and I'm going to press invoke, and hopefully the line art processor doesn't chew me out too much. Watching it generate, we didn't pass in anything in the prompt. We just passed in an inspiration image. And now we've got our, sketch being generated through to the output. We took in quite a bit of that. It's got this kind of like uplit type look. So there's some cool pieces there. The question is, do we think that this is too much inspiration? Do we want to tone it down a bit? We can go in and fine tune and tweak things as we see fit. But for now, I think this is probably a decent start. I may just tweak it a little bit so that when we save this out and people use it, it's not over stylized. So I'll change that to maybe 0.45, and then I'll save that workflow. But this is a good place to go, and a nice augmented version or a variant of our core sketch to visualize building. I see a couple people typing questions, so before I move on to the next thing, I'll answer those. As a variant of style, how could you go about lifting a color palette from a reference? There are a few ways that you could do that. You could probably just use a color palette as the style inspiration. You could take, really just any type of color palette. I'll pull one off the internet right now, and then we can use that. Let's see here. let's take this. This is a nice color palette. Copy this out. Got a nice little color palette here. I'm going to pass that in. And again, I say change this to about 0.45 as far as the inspiration goes. And I'm just passing the color palette in, and we'll see what we get. I might need to tweak this down to a little bit lower of weight if it comes in too kind of illustrative. But we should see that it takes a lot of these colors as inspiration. And again, this is just using a style IP adapter. So this is kind of like a sunset-y color palette. Now we've got this kind of like similarly colored output with our sketch. There's a couple pieces that are, you know, a little awkward, but overall I think it's pretty good. Somebody mentioned we could also go in and expose a couple of other things to the user. So if we want this to be like an advanced workflow, what can we expose? We'll say sketch strength, and we'll say we'll give the user like guidance on what we think would be a good sketch strength. We'll say 0.4 to 0.8. And then we'll add that. It's going to add that to the bottom, but we can grab the handle here and move that up next to the sketch. And then we can, maybe we'll make this below the sketch. Oh, it seems a little bit better. And then we'll do the same thing for the IP adapter, and we'll change the name of weight to inspiration strength. And we'll give them guidance of like 0.3 to 0.8. Maybe we'll do the same thing. We can say 0.3 to 0.8. You could probably have 1, 2, but just leave it to 0.8. Okay. That's going to add itself to the bottom. Somebody asked about this getting super advanced. So I'm just going to save this workflow as advanced sketch to visualize building workflow, right? So I'm like giving all these variants for however much control people want. And let's see here. Everything else is pretty good. Let's see. I could even see someone labeling different IP adapters as optional inputs. For example, one called color reference, one called material reference, one called style reference. You could do that. If you have a node in your workflow, it is going to be assumed as required. So there isn't currently an optional input. We don't have a way of bypassing an individual node if it's not used. So the way that you would do that today is creating another workflow or saving that workflow as a variant that does not require that input, right? So you'd have workflow named color reference, workflow named material reference, workflow named style reference. There's a whole host of things that you could do, but you create copies of those rather than you wouldn't have like optional inputs or try to do conditional logic in the workflow. The workflow is kind of a singular entity. Someone asked, does this mean that we can inject color palettes into the generation process? Yeah. Style IP adapters, if you pass in a control net, or not a control net, if you pass in a color palette into an IP adapter and keep the strength relatively low, it's going to take a lot of the color inspiration out of that and not really adhere to anything else. It's not trying to like generate a color palette. It's just taking the style or the colors from it. So that's just a IP adapter with the style mode set and the weight anywhere from 0.4 to 0.5. Those color palettes can influence anything that you want to generate. Glimmer is linking in the chat one of the previous studio sessions we did that is really focused on like playing around with IP adapters and doing color palettes using that style, which was really fun. I think that's actually maybe where we discovered that color palettes work, which was really cool. Is the color palette, does it need to be set in a specific format? No. You can do vertical, you can do different shapes and styles. The one thing I'll call out is that if you have the strength too high, what can happen is it can get a little too accurate to the style, it'll kind of like create like a vectorized, very colored illustrative image. So we'll try one here just to see what happens in the error mode here. And this is why we put guidance like, don't go higher than a 0.8 on this workflow or you'll get bad outputs. There's a couple of techniques that we can talk about as well. I will leave it to the audience to vote on what we talk about, whether we want to go down more advanced use cases for creating these types of applications, or if we want to try another modality and another type of workflow. But this is our very high strength, extreme representation with this color palette. And it's going to make it a lot bit stylized. Yeah, it's cool, but it's not maybe what we're going for, right? It takes away from the core style that we're prompting to get. So this is obviously a cool workflow. So two ways that we can go from here. We can try generating another workflow. We can play around with, a different workflow and a different use case. Or we can talk about some advanced interface techniques so you can build workflows that maybe bake some of this guidance into the controls that you're providing users. I'll let people vote. Do we want to go more like advanced workflow interface building, or do we want to go, okay, someone said advanced workflow. Okay, here we go. It's going to be fun. All right. Yep, people say advanced workflow. Let's do the advanced workflow. All right. So let's say that we've kind of done a low effort guidance here by providing inspiration strength, and giving kind of like what you want that to be, right? What you can do instead is pull in, we'll do a float. Start with a float primitive, okay? And we're going to call this inspiration strength. And really all you're doing is asking yourself, what are the values I want to give my user, right? What's going to make the most sense for them? And so the example that we did, if you use the upscaling tab, right? The upscaling tab in Invoke, this is kind of what we did when we were building the initial workflow for that, was we just did a little bit of math to make the input a little bit easier and more accessible, but the math on the back end calculated what the settings should be. So in this case, we've got 0.3 to 0.8 for inspiration strength. And what that means for us is, we can ask ourselves, what would we want that scale to be for our users? Maybe we want that to be 0 to 10. Okay, we're going to keep it pretty simple. Do you want low inspiration or high inspiration? Now, it's a little bit weird having 0 because it's kind of the user would assume that it gets no inspiration from it. But in this case, we'll convey that to the user, or maybe we'll set it at 1. We can kind of like tell them whatever we want. And then we're just going to figure out how would that input mathematically be calculated to result in these numbers, right? So if the user has 0, we want that to be 0.3. So we will do some float math. We'll pass in our inspiration strengths. We'll add 0.3. And then we are going to do some other math here as well. So there's kind of like a base of 0.3. And then what I'm going to do is a secondary one where I'm going to multiply this by 0.05, I think, right? So the difference between 0.3 and 0.8 is about 0.5, and I want 10 different increments of that. So I divide that 0.5 by 10, I get 0.05. So I'm going to multiply each one of those by an increment. And then I'm just going to add these two together. So I'm going to take this value, float, math, add that, and we're going to put that as our inspiration string, right? Tuck all that math away because I'm sure some people on here are being triggered by the math. And now we've got our inspiration strength 0 to 10. I'm going to add that in the UI. So now we have a simpler slider. The user doesn't have to do, let's see, people are saying I did the math wrong. I don't think I did, but I'm going to, you're right. You're probably right. You guys are probably right. Yeah, we'll do this. So we're multiplying that by that. I guess technically this is kind of a duplicate node. That's what we're saying here. That it would get to the same thing, but I'll just show you what we did. We'll just add 0.3 here, right? So 0 times this plus 0.3, and we get to the answer. It would have been the same either way because we were adding the 0 to 0.3. Oh no, you're right. Math is hard. All right. So now we've got our corrected inspiration strength, 0, whatever this is, times our increment plus the base, and then we get to our math. We did it, team. We did it. That will give us our output strength, and then we can use it. So in this case, I'll leave it at 0. I'll get another color palette just so that we can test out some other fun color palettes. I'll do another color palette here. Throw that in. And we'll do our modern house. And we're generating that and using the very low inspiration strength for our input. Yes, somebody called that. Would have been the same when the input was 0. That's correct. You all are correct here. And I have admitted that live. I'm not infallible. You got me. This did a really good job of pulling in the color palette, kept the inspiration low, and this, again, this is inspiration of 0. If we change this to inspiration of 5, we'll kind of bring up back to that middle point in the workflow, and it'll be a little bit more inspired by our input. This makes this flexible, right? We can tell users use a low inspiration strength when you are doing just color palettes and things like that. Use a higher one when you want to like really capture the style or whatever content is inside of that image. This one got really funky if we went a little bit higher on the inspiration strength. So like I said, when you're doing color palettes, don't go too high. So now we've got this, which is still interesting and kind of artistic, but probably not what we're going for. So I think that gives you the gist of how to do some kind of nice user-friendly experiences with workflows. You can kind of like do some of this math behind the scenes for them so that it just is easier to use. I won't go into too much depth about where and all the places you could do that. But you can certainly take just some other ideas for you to noodle on. You can take an input and have it control 2 sliders. You could have this control both the inspiration, the weight, as well as the in-step percentage. So you could get one slider that does numerous things and kind of controls all of that. This gives you a lot of really powerful interface control when you're building this for your team. You can kind of go in and really flex some of those inputs that they might have that are easier for them to digest and really kind of pass that on in a way that ultimately makes the overall workflow more powerful and easier to use. And this is really, I think a good example of how you can build workflows is just to look at the upscaling tab. Invoke's upscaling tab started as this type of workflow. We made this workflow to prototype and test around different variables and really make sure that it was going to be usable. And that's how we prototyped it to then build it into the tab. Now, the tab has some other niceties to it because we're building that into the interface. But you've got a lot of the same capabilities here and really creating your own workflow and flexing that as your own interface, if you will, or mini application for this. Someone said, is it possible to make a simple dropdown that had, say, watercolor, oil painting, concept art, and then expand that into pre-baked, more detailed style text? Not yet. Not yet. But there is a feature being worked on right now that you'll see in an upcoming version that has style presets, or I should say prompt templates. And those prompt templates will be exposed in the interface. We may at some point look at exposing those in nodes as well so that you can use those as a node. It certainly makes some sense to do that. Can we write custom nodes? Yeah, if you're using the community edition and you want to experiment with writing your own custom node, you can do so. There's a lot of guidance on that. If you write something that you think is useful for the community, useful for more than just yourself, and is extremely valuable, you can actually submit that to be included in the core set of Invoke nodes, and everyone would get that as part of the core Invoke application. So you can create custom nodes to play around with locally on your computer when you're ready for prime time and want that to be kind of like a core feature that everyone has. If you think it's that type of feature you want to contribute back to Invoke, you can share that with everybody. But more information on writing custom nodes and extending the community edition are on the GitHub in the contributing section underneath nodes documentation. So somebody asked the question, join the webcast late. If you didn't discuss how this relates to Comfy UI, could you discuss how Comfy UI relates to Invoke? Do they just look similar or do they share code? Invoke and Comfy are completely separate implementations of Stable Diffusion. They have different code bases. They are extended with nodes that are written in a different way. Invoke has, I would say, a higher amount of requirements for a node to be functional. We require things to be typed. There's a lot of security and I would say niceties from a development perspective for making sure that it's just going to play well with the rest of the interface. That's all baked into the requirements of writing in a node. But they are different code bases. The workflows that power Invoke, a lot of the nodes are maintained by the core Invoke team. And that's what you get when you install. You don't have to install any node packs or extensions for things like ControlNet or IP adapter. You don't have to worry about those being maintained because they're not maintained by contributors. They're maintained by our core team, and they are integrated into the rest of our user interface. So that's why when we started this, when we use the generation tab, that generation tab is actually using workflows behind the scenes to run this because everything is running using the Invoke engine. And the Invoke engine is able to take all of these workflows and run them and execute them because it's built on its own kind of backend, right? But this is all integrated together into one broader generative studio. And that's kind of the, I would say, main difference of Invoke is it's focusing on integrating that as an end-to-end experience where you can deploy this out to teams and multiple users rather than just being a one singular node engine. Somebody called out that Easy Diffusion was an older application that had some style presets with little icons. Stay tuned, that's coming soon. And you'll be able to customize it and all that fun stuff. So that's coming. We've got 13 minutes left, and I think we can squeak out one more workflow. I think we can get one more thing done. And I think I've got another asset here I can use. Yeah, so I've got this one here. Let's see how I want to approach this. I could either... Yeah, we'll just build this in the workflows. We'll talk about if I wanted to use a base existing workflow that I had and extend it a little bit. I'm just going to open up our existing one here, and we'll do a double control net. Double control net. I'm going to delete my IP adapter out, and I'm going to save this workflow as render to visualize building. Creating another workflow here. We will change this to upload your render. And what we're going to do here is going to a depth anything processor. And we'll do a any processor. And I'm going to take this and put these as my detect. We have detect an image resolution coming from that. I'm going to do the same thing for the depth anything resolution. Take out our line art processor. And I want this canny image to go here. Maybe I'll leave it as scribble. I could switch it to canny or scribble. I'm going to switch it to canny just to be fully accurate here. And I want my depth anything to go into a control net. We've got a couple of questions coming in, which I'll answer momentarily. Want to lose my train of thought here as I'm adding. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking the singular image and I'm going to have it processed in two different ways, right? One image comes in, one processor is going to look at the depth. It's going to try to find like the 3D space, monocular depth estimation. It's going to kind of pull that out. The other is going to look at the edges. Now the edges, I probably want that to be a little bit lower. So I'm going to bring that down to like 0.4, maybe 0.5. And that's just because I want to retain some of the edges in the image. So while the depth estimation is going to pull out a lot of things like where is stuff in space, I want to capture some of the details around like, you know, the siding, the material, kind of like texture. I want that to be retained. So I want to look at the lines, but I want to also primarily look at the depths to get kind of like a real understanding of where this is in space. If I want the color from this, because this one does have color in it. Look at this. This one's got some color. This is where it can be really interesting to use stuff like either an initial image or a tile control net. This is very advanced, but we're going to come out of this with a really cool workflow. So I'm going to use this. We'll add one more. I'm going to add a control net here. This one doesn't need a processor. You don't need a tile processor. You can just pass that directly in. And this one will be a tile control net. And I'm going to keep the weight here relatively low. I just want to kind of like inspire it with color. And that's going to be like 0.4 weight and a 0.6 in step. So this is definitely getting fun here. Pass all of those control nets in. Do 0.8 on the depths. Need our image to be in here. It's getting kind of fun, isn't it? So this is where if I wanted to connect all of those weights. So this is our edge strengths. So I can either expose them individually. So, you know, this is depth, strength, and then, you know, color, strength. And this is one way to make this kind of like a little optional. Because if you make the strength 0, then it'll actually pretty much ignore that control net almost entirely. So This is one way that you can make that. I'll actually call this base image strength, maybe more accurate. The other thing you can do is if you wanted to make that all singular, you could add in a float primitive and just call it, image strength, and do some like math so that that's, passing in the right value to each of those. So similar to how we did that earlier, you just expose this one thing to your user, and then you would do some math to kind of like figure out, okay, well, if the image strength is this, that would probably mean the edges should be here and the depth should be here, and the tile image should be here. I won't do that because we're running out of time and I want to actually run this thing to see if it works. So I'll just expose those for now. Is there anything else we need to do, or is this perfect? What a workflow. What a workflow. Okay. We're going to save this workflow, go to my viewer. We're going to drop in our render, cross our fingers. Feeling mostly good about it. We'll give it a shot. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of like take this very simple render and just amp it up, make it real, make it look like a photo, right? We might need to decrease some of the strengths a little bit. We'll see where we end up landing. But this could give us a nice tool and technique for taking the render and really just like amping that up. Somebody asked a really good question. Is there a way to see in the workflow what the edge strength has created? We're going to go into the editor because yes, there is. So when you're in the editor, you can actually watch the entire workflow executing. We're seeing it here right now. We take a look at the top right, you can see it's generating our image and it's kind of on the denoise latence process. On each individual node that is executed, you can see which ones have completed. When it has been completed, you can click the node and you'll get a whole bunch of details in the node viewer in the bottom left. So this will tell you information about it and all that kind of stuff. You can also put notes in. So these are kind of like comments, if you will, for someone who's coming in and editing this in the future. This is just like a way to like document your thoughts. But you can see on each one of these, the specific process outputs that came from that. So you can actually check when it's completed, what it output. If you want to, and you want to debug this as you're testing things out, you can click Save to Gallery on these individual nodes, and that way it'll actually output that to your gallery. So this is one way to have a workflow generate multiple images, is if you have multiple nodes with Save to Gallery, those will all go out to the gallery, and you can pick which board it goes to by clicking the board, and that'll just save that to the right gallery when you do that. But yeah, that's how you're going to debug and edit the workflow as you're kind of working through it. And then when you're ready to save that out, you would turn that off and then ship it to the user. This can be a good way as well if you want to create multiple outputs and kind of like do some image transformations to have a couple of different options. You can have multiple, that image output go through a couple of transformation nodes and then save each of those to the gallery. So each time you click this, it's actually generating multiple options. So in this case, we've got our rendered output here. It kind of, and I would say it's fair that it interpreted these kind of like green blobs as rocks. I think that's like, I don't criticize the AI at all for looking at the depth map for that and thinking that those are rocks. So we go in and actually check the depth anything processor. It's definitely blocky. It's definitely blocky. Somebody asked who made that render. It's my little brother is an architect, and I asked him for some architectural renders, and so he gave me some, which I am very grateful for, as I would have otherwise had some very poor content for today. So this ultimately, I think, captures a lot of the core aesthetic that we were going for in the render. We've got a more realistic output now. There's a lot of really cool stuff here to use. We will save these workflows out. You can use them on your own. but hopefully today has been really helpful in thinking about how you might create workflows for your team or for yourself if you're using this as an individual. These are great ways to create tools, and you can have a lot of fun really thinking about what are all the different ways that I might want to get control, and what are different like tasks that I might use the tool for, and how can I standardize those for the team. So hopefully it's been helpful. We will share out the recording once we get it captured, and we'll see you all at the next one. It's been a lot of fun. Take care.